3 decades on death row, 3 lives lost in one night, and a family home reduced to ashes. The story of Antonio Sanchez Franklin is not just about murder. It's about betrayal, silence, and rage that destroyed generations in Dayton, Ohio. After nearly 30 years behind bars, Franklin's name has returned to Ohio's execution calendar. Date: February 11, 2026. But before that day arrives, we have to go back. Back to 1997. Back to the house on Regal Street. And back to the night the Franklin family was silenced forever. Dayton, Ohio. A city of factories, small neighborhoods, and ordinary working-class families. By the late 1990s, jobs were declining and crime was on the rise. But on Regal Street, life seemed steady. Neighbors looked after one another, porches filled with conversation, and families built their lives in modest 2-story homes. Inside one of those homes lived the Franklin family. Ivory Franklin, 76 years old. A man who had worked his entire life. Quiet, disciplined, the kind of grandfather who believed in hard work and respect. Ivory wanted peace in his twilight years, a home where family came first. Oilia Franklin, 71. His wife. Soft-spoken, gentle, known by neighbors for her kind voice and warm heart. Oilia was the soul of the household, the one who kept family ties strong. Anthony Franklin, 38. Their son. Independent but close to his parents. He had returned home after struggling financially, and though it wasn't always easy, he remained devoted to family. And then there was their grandson, Antonio Sanchez Franklin, 18 years old. A young man caught between youth and adulthood. On the surface, Antonio looked like any other teenager in Dayton, with baggy clothes, a sharp haircut, and a quiet stare that hid more than it revealed. But beneath it was a storm. His childhood had been fractured. His mother had left him at a young age, choosing distance over motherhood. Raised by his grandparents, Antonio was given shelter, food, and structure, but little could replace the absence of parental love. Teachers described him as quiet and withdrawn. Friends noticed flashes of temper. And inside the Franklin home, tensions grew. Antonio resented rules. He resented expectations. And most of all, he resented the feeling that his life was going nowhere. Those emotions simmered quietly for years, until the spring of 1997, when they erupted. April 18, 1997. Dayton, Ohio. The neighborhood around Regal Street was still. Porch lights flickered out one by one, windows turned dark, and the houses settled into silence. Inside the Franklin home, it was just another evening. Ivory watched television in his chair. Oilia tidied up the kitchen. Anthony, their son, prepared for the next day's work. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to foreshadow the violence that was coming. Antonio left the house that night. Neighbors remembered seeing him walking down the street, head low, hands in his pockets. No one thought much of it. But Antonio wasn't just going for a walk. He was planning his return. Before dawn, Antonio came back. Only this time, he wasn't empty-handed. In his grip, a baseball bat. In his bag, gasoline. And inside him, rage that had been boiling for months. The details that followed would shock Dayton. One by one, Antonio moved through the house. His grandparents. His uncle. Victims not of strangers, not of burglars, but of their own blood. When the silence finally settled, 3 lives had been taken. And then, to erase it all, Antonio turned to fire. Gasoline poured across the floorboards, catching on fabric, wood, and memory. Within minutes, flames rose into the night sky. Neighbors woke to the smell of smoke. Some ran outside, calling 911. Others stood frozen as orange light lit the windows of the Franklin home. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was engulfed. But inside it was already too late. 3 members of the Franklin family were gone. And the one responsible was their own grandson. The morning after the fire, Dayton police and fire investigators combed through the charred remains of the Franklin home. At first, it looked like a tragic accident, a fire that had spread too quickly. But then they looked closer. The burn patterns told a different story, multiple points of ignition, the presence of gasoline residue, and most haunting of all, the discovery of blunt force trauma on the victims' bodies. This was no accident. This was murder. As detectives began piecing together the timeline, one name surfaced almost immediately: Antonio Sanchez Franklin. He had been seen leaving the house late that night. He had a rocky relationship with his family. And most importantly, he had vanished in the hours after the fire. Within days, police found him. When they did, he was calm, almost detached. He offered little resistance as he was placed in handcuffs. And when his mugshot was taken, the world saw not a hardened criminal, but an 18-year-old, stone-faced, silent, with eyes that seemed to carry no remorse. In 1998, the case of State of Ohio versus Antonio Sanchez Franklin opened inside a Montgomery County courtroom. From the very start, prosecutors painted the picture of a cold, calculated killer. A teenager who turned on the very people who raised him. They described the brutality of the attack, the deliberate use of gasoline, the attempt to erase every trace of the crime. The prosecution's case was strong. Physical evidence, fire investigation reports, and the chilling reality that Antonio had been the last person seen in the house that night. But the defense had a different story to tell. Antonio's lawyers didn't deny the killings. Instead, they sought to explain them. They argued that Antonio was a product of a broken childhood, that being abandoned by his mother left him scarred and angry. Those years of resentment toward his grandparents and uncle had built up like a pressure cooker. Psychologists testified that Antonio showed signs of depression and emotional instability. One expert suggested he lacked the maturity to fully grasp the weight of his actions. But for the jury, the question wasn't whether Antonio had suffered. The question was whether that suffering excused what he had done. And as graphic crime scene photos were shown in court, the jury's silence said it all. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The room fell silent as the foreman stood and read the words that would define Antonio's life. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of aggravated murder, arson, and aggravated robbery." Antonio showed little reaction. No outburst. No apology. Just the same blank stare that had followed him from arrest to trial. But the verdict was only the beginning. Now came the question of punishment. In Ohio, a guilty verdict in an aggravated murder case carried the possibility of the ultimate punishment, death. The jury recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed. And in 1998, Antonio Sanchez Franklin was formally sentenced to death. From that moment on, Antonio's world shrank. Gone were the open streets of Dayton. Gone were the freedoms of youth. Instead, he was transported to a place infamous in Ohio's history, the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, a place known simply as Death Row. In 1998, just months after his trial ended, Antonio Sanchez Franklin was placed on Ohio's death row at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. Lucasville is a place most Ohioans know by reputation. High walls, razor wire, guard towers overlooking miles of farmland. A fortress where the state keeps its most dangerous and most condemned prisoners. For Antonio, this would become his entire world. Over the years, Antonio became known as one of the quiet ones. Guards described him as disciplined, rarely causing trouble, never drawing attention to himself. Unlike some inmates who wrote letters to journalists or sought public sympathy, Antonio stayed in the shadows. He gave no interviews. He filed no public statements. He lived in silence. Then something unexpected happened. By the early 2000s, Ohio had become one of the most active death penalty states in America. But as the years passed, executions slowed and then stopped. The problem wasn't the courts. It was the method. Ohio struggled to obtain the drugs needed for lethal injection. Men on death row lived in limbo, sentenced to die, but with no date on the calendar. For Franklin, this meant years of waiting. And so the years ticked by. Antonio Sanchez Franklin grew older in the same cell. The boy who had entered death row. By 2023, Ohio officials announced their intention to restart executions. And when the new calendar was released, one name appeared near the top: Antonio Sanchez Franklin. After nearly 30 years of waiting, the state of Ohio would once again carry out an execution. And he became the man scheduled first. Date: February 11, 2026. For the first time in decades, Franklin's life had an expiration date. And the silence of death row was broken by the sound of finality. But here lies the haunting question: what does justice mean after nearly 3 decades? For some, it is simple: 3 lives taken, 1 life must be given. For others, the years between crime and punishment weaken the meaning. Antonio has lived for 30 years in a cell. His victims never had that chance. Which punishment is heavier? Living decades in silence, knowing death is coming, or losing everything in one violent night? There is no easy answer. This was the story of Antonio Sanchez Franklin. If you found this story haunting, subscribe to the Crime Vaults for more chilling true crime documentaries every day.